Okay, so explain, if you can, the rise of anti-Semitism.
We are deemed as Marxist for the far right, or for the far left, we are deemed as capitalist. There's nothing in between. I've been to Israel 3 times. Even though we were experiencing, and we're still experiencing, a war, I felt much safer than I do when I walk in the streets of many Western European capitals. Right now, the youth is embracing cultural Marxist principles and policies that are very, very dangerous.
Hello, my name is Justin Stairs, and this is the Brussels Signal Studio. We have a guest for your pleasure today. His name is Juan Caldes, and he is the EU Affairs Officer for the European Jewish Association. Juan, thank you for coming in and finding the time.
Thank you for having me.
So, we are here to talk about what you do and Jewish affairs in the world at large. Perhaps we could start by you just defining your job. I mean, I know that you're here with the European Jewish Association, but does that mean that you are a lobbyist, or how would you define yourself?
Well, once again, thank you very much for the invitation and for having me here today. Yes, I work at the European Jewish Association, which is based here in Brussels. And basically, the main thing that we do is we work with EU institutions here in Brussels, with the Commission, with the Parliament mainly, and also with national parliaments all across the EU. And the main job that we perform is that we try to aim to combat anti-Semitism as much as we can, especially since the October 7th attacks perpetrated by Hamas. And yeah, I mean, one could say that, we do lobby, because it's a very, it's not a nice word to be used. We prefer to use advocates in today's world, I feel like, because it's all about political correctness. But I don't think just the word lobby should be bad, because I think at the end of the day, everyone in this city, in one way or another, they lobby. So I think it's better just to give the facts and just be clear about what we do. And yeah, we do lobby on behalf of Jewish communities from all over Europe, because we're a Jewish organization. And the main thing that we do, as I said before, is to defend the interests of the European Jewry, so we can make sure that we have an everlasting future in this continent that we've been part of for the past 2,000 years. And this is what we do, represent the interests of...
Right, in fact, on that subject, I have one of your quotes prepared for me. Being a young Jew in today's Europe is an honor, but also an obligation because of the history our people have. The Jewish presence here goes back for over 2,000 years, and the Judeo-Christian Greco-Roman roots are still very much present. Now, just on the subject of lobbying, obviously I understand that you represent European Jewry, as you just said, but do you ever get involved in the nitty-gritty of lobbying in specific laws? I don't know, the Green Deal or the Migration Pact. Do you follow specific laws, or is it more of an overarching thing?
It's more of an overarching thing, especially related to Jewish laws and pro-Israel laws. Those are the two main things that we do. We focus on combating anti-Semitism in the continent, but also, since October the 7th, we are not only a Jewish organization, but a Zionist organization. And that's something that we could get into, because I think it's very important to describe what it means to be a Zionist, because today, in today's world, I think most people use it without knowing what it actually means, which many people think that it's automatically an Israeli organization, which that's not the case, because we are European and Jewish. But it just so happens that, like most Jewish organizations and most Jewish people, we have a sympathy and a closer alignment with the state of Israel, because it's the only Jewish and democratic state in the world. But that is something that we could get into. And just
well, you've mentioned it, so let's do it. The difference between the two terms, please.
So for me, Zionism, and I think this is very important in today's discussion, many people, as I've mentioned, they don't understand what it actually means. Zionism is nothing more than the right of not only of self-defense, but self-determination for the Jewish people to have their own state in their own ancestral homeland, which is Judea and Samaria, which later was coined by the Romans as Palestine. That's how they coined it. Once there was the second expulsion of the temple in Jerusalem with the Romans, and then we went into the diaspora for 2,000 years. So Zionism is nothing more than having the right of self-determination for the Jewish people to have their own state, as we do right now, as it was clear in 1948, after 2,000 years of endless persecutions, pogroms, and attempts of extermination. So that is what Zionism is about. So when President Biden says, you don't need to be a Jew to be a Zionist, I completely agree with him, because his whole life he's been unconditionally supporting Israel as a proud Catholic that he is, as he has claimed to be, but he defends Israel's right not only to defend themselves, but to exist. Most importantly, to exist, as many countries and many in today's world, many far left and far right organizations proclaim to believe in.
Okay, so you can be pro-Jewish and anti-Israel?
That is a very good question. In my personal view, I think that is a very slippery slope because, as I mentioned, one can be critical of the government. That is different than being critical of the existence of the state.
Okay.
So for me, and if we go along with the IRA definition, which many people might not be familiar with, the IRA definition, the working definition of anti-Semitism, stipulates very clearly what anti-Semitism is and what it constitutes. So anti-Semitism, it's not everything. Absolutely not. If you criticize Bibi Netanyahu's policies in terms of how he's waging war, that's no anti-Semitism whatsoever.
Okay.
Just like I could criticize the prime minister of my own country, of Spain, Pedro Sánchez, and I'm not anti-Spanish. That is one thing. You can be very vocal against this government and criticize the policies of the government. Absolutely. But another very different thing is to question the legitimization of the existence of the only Jewish state in the world, just like if I could be able to question the existence of any country in the world.
Okay,
So
okay. Now that's you've made it very clear, because sometimes I see, and please treat me as if I was totally ignorant, but sometimes I see on social media, for example, those who are protesting against the war or against Israel's actions at the moment are called anti-Semites.
Right.
So in theory, that could be an incorrect label.
Right. So obviously, I try to avoid generalizations. I try to do case by case because we live in a very polarized world in which we just categorize really easily. But that being said, I will say that someone who comes to me to the table and says that he's an anti-Zionist, but he supports Jewish life, I disagree with that. Because if you support Jewish life, then you would support the right of more than half of the Jewish population in the world to live in the only Jewish state in the world, which is the state of Israel. Because we have between 15 to 18 million Jews in the world. That's it. Many people think that there's hundreds of us. No, 15 to 18 million, which is nothing. It's a fraction. It's 0.03 of the world's population. That being said, right now, more than half of that population, of that Jewish population, lives in Israel. So if you're saying that you're an anti-Zionist, you're basically saying that those Jews do not have any right to live. Basically, you're aligning with the people that say from the river to the sea, Palestine should be free, meaning a one-state solution from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. There's only one state solution, which is the total extermination of the Jewish people.
Right, but my point was those protesting against the war are should not necessarily all be branded as anti-Semites.
No, absolutely not, because there's some people that see the humanitarian crisis that is unfolding in the Gaza Strip, and they have every right to protest as someone who believes in freedom of speech. But we have to be careful with, for me, the moment that we see incitement towards violence, that is where I draw the line. Because in those protests, I've heard many people saying, gas the Jews, death to Israel.
Okay.
That is where I would deem the main difference. But
Understood.
if you care about the humanitarian situation of what's happening in Gaza, you are entitled to do so, because every human life, be it Israeli or Palestinian, for people who absolutely respect human dignity and the individual, we are heartbroken by these scenes and everything we see. But that being said, the first thing, if you want to end this war, you should also be calling for the release, unconditional release, of all the hostages that were taken from their homes, Holocaust survivors and 1-year-old babies that are still in the dungeons of Gaza.
Understood. Okay, now you've been here for a couple of years, and how has your job changed since the 7th of October last year? And has there been any change in relations between EU states, EU peoples, and the Jewry that you represent?
Well, actually, our life has drastically changed since October the 7th for obvious reasons, because we've seen a dramatic spike and rise of anti-Semitism that we didn't see since the times of the Shoah, since the times of the Holocaust. Because people need to understand the proportion of what happened on October the 7th when 1,200 innocent civilians were massacred, brutally massacred the way that they were. Proportionally speaking, that was the largest massacre perpetrated against the Jewish people since the times of the Shoah. We've seen the consequences of that, how that's impacted on all of us as Jews in the diaspora, be it in Europe, be it in the US, be it in Latin America, where we have the largest populations. And we've seen how we have security in order to go to our synagogues, just to pray. The other day we had Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the Jewish calendar. we had a lot of security outside of the synagogue just to go to
Here
pray.
in Belgium?
Here in Belgium,
Right.
in Brussels. I think that's unacceptable. This continent, when the European Union was founded, one of the main premises was that Leolam Leod in Hebrew, never again. What the horrors of the Holocaust should never happen, not just against the Jewish people, but against any other one, any other minority, anyone else. And to see that only 80 years later, in order to go to the synagogue or to go to a Jewish school, parents that are dropping off their kids, they still need security because the real threat, especially in today's world coming from Islamists and the far left, which is very palpable and you can see it on the streets. I think this is absolutely, Europe is failing us. The European Union is failing us in that sense because they deeply say, they care about, what I might say might be a bit too much, but I think it's important to say it. To me, it seems like the European Union and many of their leaders, they deeply care more about dead Jews than they do about the living Jews. When they come to the commemorations, like the Holocaust, the International Holocaust Remembrance Day on the 27th of January that we celebrate every year, they say that the Holocaust should never happen again. We all agree with that premise. But what about the living Jews? What about people like me? Why do we have to be threatened when we go on the streets? Why do I have...
Have you experienced personal threats?
I personally, if I don't wear my kippah, like I'm wearing it now, or my Magen David, no, because no one would recognize me as a Jewish person. But if they see Jewish symbols, there's a chance that something could happen. And it has happened to a lot of people. In our own building, where we are in the European Jewish Association, we have private security outside of our building. And to this day, I've had cases of many people that I know where they've experienced physical, verbal, or emotional assaults. And that, I think, it's unacceptable. I think that if I'm walking through the streets of my continent as a proud European Jew, the last thing that I should be feeling is that sentiment that our grandparents experienced during the 1930s, which was that feeling that wherever you would go, you could see that they were marking you and treating you as the different one, the Jew. And if we believe in a Europe of equality for all, that should be the last thing that should be happening.
Have you changed your behavior? Do you, for example, not wear any evident signs of your religion?
When I'm on the streets, I have to say it depends in the city or country that I am in the European Union, because obviously we have 27 EU member countries. But when I'm walking through the streets of Eastern Europe or places like Budapest or in Serbia, for example, I feel much safer than I do in Brussels or in London, or in Paris, or in Amsterdam.
Okay, so explain, if you can, the rise of anti-Semitism, because I remember reading, actually, in the Brussels, in the Belgian press, going back 10 years or more, that there were already complaints about a rise in anti-Semitism among the Jews living here in Belgium. How would you explain this trend?
So, first of all, anti-Semitism is, in many cases, it's not rational. It's illogical if you look at it, why people hate and absolutely despise the Jews. In some cases, it might come from a place of ignorance or stereotypes or tropes that they've heard throughout their lives, such as Jews controlling Hollywood or the banking industry, which are totally and utterly false, because that's not true. There's rich Jews, there's poor Jews, just like with any other group. You cannot generalize in those terms. That being said, I think that the war has been the perfect excuse for many to come out from the place where they were hiding, and they've openly said how much they hate Jews, obviously disguised in their hate towards the Jewish state, but not towards the Jewish community. So they try to do it in a very smart way, because obviously if you try to say that you hate Jews, many people would automatically say that you're close to Hitler, to neo-Nazis, even though you might be coming from the far left. But the thing is, we're never good enough for many people. Either we are deemed as Marxist for the far right, or for the far left, we are deemed as capitalist. There's nothing in between. And now what we've seen, what we are experiencing, is this dramatic surgence in which many of us feel safer walking down the streets of Israel. Right now, Israel is facing a multi-front war for its very existence, for the soul of the nation, against 7 different countries, all, by the way, with the octopus, which is behind, which is the Islamic Republic of Iran. And many of us, especially me, this past year, I've been to Israel 3 times. 3 times in which, when I was walking down the streets of Tel Aviv or Jerusalem, even though we were experiencing, and we're still experiencing, a war, I felt much safer than I do when I walk in the streets of many Western European capitals.
Understood. Now, did I hear you make a quick reference to immigration there? And obviously, immigration is one of the big themes that are being discussed here in Brussels at the moment in the EU institutions. As you know, there are lots of packages of legislation, let's say. Are you connecting the rise in anti-Semitism to immigration, legal or illegal, here in the EU?
So let's just be very clear. If we speak about this, I think that it's indisputable that right now, the most existential threat to Jewish life on the continent, we see it from the combination and an alignment from far left movements and radical Islamists. That's where we see it. With immigration, I personally do not have a problem with immigration, as long as, just like anyone, as long as it is done in a legal and consistent way. That being said, right now, what I do see, and this is just an indisputable fact, when we walk down the streets of Europe, especially Western capitals, like the ones that I've mentioned, what it is a fact is that we recognize less and less Europe. Some of the places, sometimes I wonder, because there's a growing Muslim population with this, and I'll be very clear, I'm not saying that by no stretch of the imagination, that all Muslims are terrorists or that they're radical whatsoever. Of course not. There's 1 billion Muslims in the world. That being said, I feel that in Europe, we have a very radicalized, especially youth, funny enough, not the first or second generation, their parents and their grandparents that came in the 60s and 70s, but the youth right now, it is extremely radicalized, and they do not want to integrate into the European fabric, into the European project. And we see it. We see how they constitute their own Sharia law neighborhoods, in which basically they don't want to know anything about us. And they're being taught from a very young age, in some places, that they must hate the other, and they cannot integrate into our society. I totally believe that if you want to be part of this European project, you have to integrate into society that, by the way, upholds the highest level of human rights that we have in this continent when it comes to defending private property rights, when it comes to defending the rule of law, respect for any minority, be it sexual minorities, be it with race, with gender, anything. So if you're on this continent, you have to respect the premises of those Judeo-Christian and Greco-Roman values that I mentioned before, because we're descendants of that. What unites us as Jews and as Christians, mainly because it's a Judeo-Christian continent, is the fact that we come from Jerusalem, which is the capital of monotheism, from Rome, which is the capital of the rule of law, and from Greece and from Athens, which is the capital of philosophy, of Western philosophy and democracy. If you accept those premises, so be it, welcome to the continent. But if you do not, then we have a serious problem, and Europe has to wake up. Israel is giving a signal of what's happening in the Middle East. It's not a regional thing. It's expanding. They have bigger plans than that. They say it. The West is next. So if Europe doesn't wake up soon, it might be their turn.
Now, you mentioned that the picture differs according to which European country you're in. And indeed, that is the case, as we've seen. It is reflected in the policies adopted by the different EU member states. There are, as far as the war in the Middle East is concerned. For example, there are some EU countries that are very critical of Israel. We've written stories here on the Brussels Signal about this. Spain, for example. Your country. Ireland is another country. So is it fair to say that the EU is split on the war and Israel at the moment?
I think that's a very good question. I would say that we have way more allies than enemies as of right now. Thank God, we're very grateful for that. I think that the vast majority of the European bloc is still very much behind doors, behind closed doors, because you know how politics is. They very much believe in Israel's right to self-defend, and not only that, but to completely destroy Hamas militarily, because it's a terrorist Islamist organization, and they share the concern of what might happen and might take place under European soil. That being said, there are certain nations, starting with my own country, with Pedro Sánchez, who has proclaimed to be the ultimate defender of the Palestinian cause for many different reasons that we don't have too much time to cover. Ireland is a country that historically has been a sympathizer of the Palestinian cause because of the message of the oppressor and the oppressee, in their case against, it's what they say, against the UK, against Great Britain, against England, for how they've been treated throughout centuries.
Against Ireland, yes.
Against Ireland. Ireland has been treated by Britain, as they proclaim. In the case of the Palestinians, by Israel. So they will always...
The underdogs.
The underdogs. Because we live in a world that is very much about good and bad, right or wrong. And in this case, oppressee, oppressed, because it's a very woke world. We very much care about protecting the underdog. Which, by the way, that so-called underdog doesn't necessarily to be on the right side of history. And that is something that we should make very clear. Just because you might, quote unquote, again, because that is very subjective, be on that side, it doesn't mean that you're on the right side of history.
Okay.
When you're aligning yourself with terrorist organizations like Hamas, like Islamic Jihad and others, Hezbollah, that are openly calling for the extermination of an entire people, and you pretend to care about those, we have a problem because, by the way, these people, I've always called them the useful idiots. The far left people that are taking on the streets with radical Islamists are the people that they cannot see it for some reason because they're blind, but they're next. Do you honestly believe that if you're part of one of those communities, such as the LGBTQ community, for example, do you think you would have any rights whatsoever in the Gaza Strip under Hamas?
I've heard this argument, indeed.
Or with Hezbollah? None whatsoever.
Okay. Oh, but to just finish off on that specific topic, there are 27 countries in the European Union. How many would you estimate are on your side, and how many are on the side of the Spanish and the Irish?
I would say that with Spain, as of right now, we don't have that many, because when Pedro Sánchez went on that European tour trying to convince countries to unilaterally declare a Palestinian state,
right,
there were only Ireland, obviously, as I said, it's always going to be there. Luxembourg a bit, but they pulled back, and then Slovenia. That was it. That was a great adventure of Pedro Sánchez. So I was very happy to see that the vast majority of countries were not aligning with that position, because they said, of course we do believe in a Palestinian state, but this should not come from a unilateral declaration, which, by the way, is not going to change the reality on the ground. That has to happen because Israelis and Palestinians will sit on the table and will start to negotiate, just as they tried during the Oslo Accords and others. So I was very happy to see that trend, and I will say that the vast majority of European countries, some more than others, such as, for example, obviously the Hungarian government is one of the most outspoken against anti-Semitism and a big defender of Israel. That is one of the quote-unquote extreme of someone who truly believes in the Israeli cause and gives unconditional and unwavering support. Some others that are a bit more balanced in the middle, such as the case of France lately, I would say, along with Italy and others. And then we have the other extreme, which is where Spain, unfortunately, as a Spaniard, falls, along with Ireland, Slovenia, and others.
Okay. Now, here we are in Brussels, in the capital of the European Union, and there's a lot of movement, a lot of people talking about treaty change and the removal of national vetoes and maybe the creation of a true European Union foreign policy. To what extent does the EU position, as opposed to the nation states, the member states, what does it matter what the EU position is, or is the EU in terms of foreign policy anyway a secondary player?
That's an excellent question, because I do not believe in this whole concept and notion of the EU boys. I don't think there's a EU boys per se, because if you see some of the statements that were produced by the president of the parliament, Roberta Metsola, who was one of the first to visit Israel along with the president of the commission a week after October the 7th to show their solidarity and support, that was a great gesture that will never be forgotten. But on the other hand, we have the High Representative, which is Mr. Borrell, from my country again, who has been one of the most vocal, outspoken people and extremely critical against this government. And in many ways, I could even deem him as anti-Semitic by some of the statements he has produced. So you have two voices that are completely different. In theory, the High Representative should be representing the European Union's interests, along with the Commission and with the Parliament, even though there are three different ones. But we see that has not been the case. So this is why I do not believe in this whole notion of the EU voice, just because there's one person who might speak. That person just happens to be the highest representative. But that's not the case. And we see it with the 27 nations. We see how fragmented and divided they are when it comes to not just Israel, but many other issues. So I do not believe in this whole nation of the EU voice, as opposed to the US, because in the US, when we call ourselves the United States of Europe, that is not the case, because culturally, politically, we are completely different. We are 27 different countries with different mentalities and different interests. That is not the same as the United States, which is a very much more united country in that sense.
Right. You mentioned Signor Borrell and you mentioned Mrs. Metsola. You didn't mention Ursula von der Leyen, or did you? How would you assess her position?
No, I would assess her position. I mean, as I mentioned, she was one of the first ones, along with Roberta Metsola, that came into Israel just a week after October the 7th. She was one of the very first dignitaries to visit Israel. That is a gesture that will never be forgotten. Also, she implemented in the commission, there's a national plan to combat anti-Semitism, national plan at all levels for all the countries in Europe. That was passed by the commission. So she has done indeed a lot. She has been at all major important Jewish events. She was just there on October.
She's a friend.
She really is a friend. Of course, we don't have to see eye to eye on everything. No. We might have our disagreements, but I'm much more on her side than I am on the side of Josep Borrell.
Okay. I was in the European Parliament in Strasbourg last week, and just by chance I bumped into, there was a photo shoot going on, and there were lots of left-wing MEPs, socialists and Greens, what have you, and they were holding up posters saying "ceasefire now." This seems to be the message. Well, they've condensed it down into one or two words, haven't they? How do you react to that message?
Well, I am disagreeing with that ceasefire because of something that I mentioned before. I do believe that there should be a ceasefire the moment that all the hostages are back in Israel. Because it's funny, isn't it? Ceasefire now, Palestinian suffering, completely. I'm a human being. I can only sympathize when I see suffering with any human beings. But why is it that those people that keep saying ceasefire now, they forget about innocent civilians, such as a 1-year-old baby? A 1-year-old baby. Can you please tell me what is the crime that Jewish baby committed? Being born Jewish? Is that the crime of why he was kidnapped from his home? Or a Holocaust survivor? Or many others, not to mention all the ones that were killed.
Okay, so your position is ceasefire after the hostages are released? Is that
absolutely
right?
The moment that the hostages are back, we can start to have a conversation. Personally, if you ask for my opinion, I think that there should be a ceasefire when Hamas unequivocally, which will not happen, condemns what happened on October the 7th, as opposed to saying that they would do it over again and again and again, and they demilitarize themselves. So they do not possess a threat to the state of Israel.
You said it, that's not going to happen.
That is not going to happen because it's a radical, jihadist, Islamist organization.
So the chances of a ceasefire are small, if not null.
They are very minimal at the moment, but the good thing is that the military capabilities of Hamas, 23 out of the 24 battalions are completely destroyed. So Hamas doesn't possess the threat that it used to in that sense.
Okay, so let's talk bigger picture then. Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran. Are we heading towards a regional conflagration?
That's where Iran wants to bring us to. Iran wants to bring us back to the dark ages. They want to derail the process. Israel and the region was heading into a great direction with the Abraham Accords. That is something that we should be ultimately thankful to President Trump, regardless of how you might view President Trump, because there's a lot of criticism in there and there's a lot to criticize. But no one can deny that one of the greatest legacies that he's going to leave behind is the Abraham Accords, and how after 30 years there was a breakthrough when so many Muslim nations adopted a policy of saying, you know what, we have to accept it. Israel is not going anywhere. It's just a reality. Israel has been around the block for 30 years. So we might as well actually get something out of it and engage in diplomacy and peace. Great news after October the 7th. Iran and their proxies thought, once we attack, we'll have the full solidarity from the Muslim world. That has not been the case. The Abraham Accords still strong with the UAE, Morocco, Bahrain, and others. And Saudi Arabia, which we all knew it was just a matter of months because they were going to close the deal. And we all knew that normalization was going to come to the table sooner than later. Sure, they did derail it for a bit. But Saudi Arabia, let's not forget, it's another major enemy of Iran because of the Sunni-Shia divide. And at the end of the day, they're not thrilled to see what Iran is doing by putting flames into the whole region unilaterally, because that is also a major concern for the people in Riyadh.
But that sounds as if, from what you're saying, that we might avoid a regional conflict then.
I think it's in all of our interest. And I think that what is happening, the good news of this, and we saw it when Iran launched the first set of rockets and missiles on April, not just the last one on October the 1st. Right. We saw how the US, Jordan, the UK, even Saudi Arabia came into their defense. In the case of the US and UK, we could see why, because they are unconditional allies. But in the case of Jordan, even though they have a cold peace with Israel, and Saudi Arabia, we saw how they stopped some of those missiles. Sure, they would claim that it was because it was going through their territory. Understood. But at the same time, they were sending a message, if you can read in between lines. We do not agree with this position, with this radical position taken by the Republic Islamic of Iran. And deep down, behind closed doors, as it usually frequently happens, many of those leaders will tell you that they do believe that Israel is doing the dirty work that many other countries are not willing to do. Okay. Same as in this European continent.
Is there an even bigger picture? Iran, Russia, China, Ukraine. Is this a small piece in a very big puzzle?
Well, in a way it is, isn't it? Because at the end of the day, we live in a very interconnected and globalized world. And that is something that is not going to be stopped anytime soon. I think that we are clearly seeing how in this chessboard, the pieces are starting to move. In my opinion, I think that we're moving towards two different worlds. One, which is, as we conceive it, the liberal world, even though the word liberalism is very much not used properly in today's world, but that's a whole different thing. The liberal world order that was established by the US and its allies, and one that is led by China, Russia, Iran, and another actor that, by the way, is very important that we should take into account into the equation, which is Turkey. Because Turkey is a NATO member. So in theory, they're on our side. But deep down, if you see the way they've been acting and the way that Erdogan has been speaking about the war and the conflict, saying that Bibi Netanyahu is even worse of a criminal than Hitler was.
Right.
I wouldn't say that that's a NATO ally, someone that I would like to have around the block. That being said, I think that we're moving into two different worlds. We see it with the drones that are coming from Iran and the close relationship with Russia. China's a very smart player. China, for me, they're brilliant in what they do. They do it in the Chinese way. They say that they're diplomatic, they're neutral, they want to avoid everything. Same with Russia and Ukraine. Very smart. They will not get directly involved militarily. For now, it's not in their own interest because they think of the long-term play. And let's not forget, for them, the long-term play is Taiwan and what's happening in the neighborhood. So why would they come all the way to the Middle East? So I think it's in our interest to take advantage of the momentum, especially for the US. And let's not lose hope that the US, even though it has a lot of problems, it has an upcoming election that is very important to see what will happen with that.
Yeah.
And let's see what will happen, because for all of us, those of us who love the West and our values and what we stand for, it would be no good news for Russia and China to take over, because that is the alliance with the Islamists. And if that's on the right side of, if you want to be on that side of history, then we have a problem, because the moment that they take on over the world, the individual and civil liberties that we have will be completely erased.
I want to come on to your use of the term the right side of history, but before we do, let's do the US elections. If Jews in Europe could vote, who would they vote for?
I cannot get him.
You must have a feeling. You must have a feeling.
I think it depends who you ask. Obviously, I will not get...
But you talk to lots of people.
Yes, of course. I will not get involved in US politics, because that is not my job, so I mess with any European nation. But I just hope that whoever the winner is of this election will stand by Israel. And based on the track record of the two people that we have, Donald Trump, former president of the United States, impeccable record when it comes to Israel, impeccable record, recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, as the eternal capital, the Golan Heights, the Abraham Accords, and much more. With Kamala Harris, so far I have a bit more of doubts. I don't see that record, that clean record that I see with Mr. Trump when it comes to Israel. That being said, she has been very clear and vocal that she's going to follow Biden's policies, which have been extremely supportive of the Jewish state and the local Jewish community in America, which has the largest community outside of Israel. So I'm happy to see that the Democratic Party, in that sense, did not go for someone that is much more radicalized from the squad.
I'm curious, in terms of the local Jewish communities in the EU, where are the largest ones? In absolute terms and proportionally speaking?
France has the largest one. France has close to 500,000 Jews living in the country, and many of them are starting to make aliyah, which is the process of emigrating to the land of Israel because of anti-Semitism, unfortunately. And then the UK and Germany. Those are the three countries that hold the largest Jewish populations, given the fact that we are not more than maybe 2.5 million Jews in a continent of hundreds of millions.
Right. And do you know, proportionally speaking, which the largest one is? Do you know what I mean? The largest community
it would be
relation.
France. France is 500,000 of a
Okay.
country of
Okay.
65 to 70 million people.
Okay. Right, and that's great. And maybe perhaps finally, you've used the term the right side of history more than once. What do you mean by the right side of history?
Thank you for that question, because I know that many people might see it as something that is very subjective. What do you deem as the right side of history? I do not believe in this whole notion of everything has to be subjective, post-humanism, postmodernism. I don't believe in that, because that's just not ingrained in me. I think that in certain cases, gray exists. Not in certain, in most of them. I don't think that there's such thing as black and white, even though we try to paint a very easy world, easy label, because we live in a very lazy world, intellectually speaking. That being said, I think that in the case of Israel, and not because I'm speaking as a Jew, but in the case of Israel, we can clearly see it. If you, as I mentioned before, how could anyone on their right mind defend the October 7th atrocities? How could anyone defend kidnapping? How could anyone defend murdering? How could anyone defend raping? And I could go on with the list. If you defend that, we do have a problem. If those are your morals and values. That being said, of course, many would say, no, I condemn that. I absolutely condemn. And I'm still in favor of a Palestinian statehood. And I think that the response carried by the military and by the government of Israel has been a bit too much. We can debate that. No problem whatsoever. But my problem is the moment that you embrace certain totalitarian ideologies. This continent has suffered a lot in the 20th century. We had the isms of nationalism, of fascism, of communism, and Nazism. That legacy left more than 100 million people dying.
Right. So, but just to simplify then, are you saying that anyone who is in favor of totalitarianism is on the wrong side of history? Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. And my problem with this, and
democratic discourse.
Absolutely, and I'll tell you why. Because for me, the major and most existential threat and now I'm not talking about a Jewish life, to European life, is coming from the far left movements. The far right that we conceived, because the concept of far right, as you well know, as much as I do, is a term that is frequently used to deem everything that you don't agree with from the people from the far left, which I personally do not agree with. That being said, there's still certain fractions from the far right, from actual fascism and Nazism that is still there, that we should fully condemn and ostracize it as much as we can from our society. That being said, the youth right now, is embracing cultural Marxist principles and policies that are very, very dangerous, because behind that message of peace, global peace, and humanitarian causes and equality, which might seem very nice, there is a totalitarian regime that is standing. Basically, we see it, especially on social media platforms, the moment that you disagree with what I say, you will be canceled, completely canceled. And that happens a lot with the so-called progressives. So what I'm most terrified about is that I will not be able to live in a Europe in which I can freely express my mind. Because now they're starting with my right to express myself freely. But what is next? How I will dream, how I will think. And this is what happens in many of these movements. And as I said before, we should wake up before it's too late.
We'll leave it there. Many thanks, Juan Caldes, for coming into the studio.
Thank you very much.
And thank you very much for watching.